To the world, Arthur was just a shadow in a blue jumpsuit. For 30 years, he walked the halls of Aether Dynamics with a mop in his hand and silence in his heart. The young executives, fueled by caffeine and ego, never looked him in the eye. To them, he was part of the furniture, but Arthur didn't mind. He knew the secrets hidden in the dust they left behind. He saw the rot before they did. Every morning at 5 a.m., Arthur polished the brass plaque in the lobby. It bore no name, only a symbol, a golden compass. The current CEO, Julian Vane, was a man who worshipped profit and loathed weakness. He often joked that Arthur was older than the building itself. Julian didn't know that Arthur had laid the very first brick of this empire. He didn't know that the silent architect was watching his every move. The crisis hit on a rainy Tuesday. The company's servers were locked by a cyber attack of unprecedented scale. Billions were vanishing. Julian screamed at his top engineers, but they stood helpless. The hackers were using a legacy encryption from 1995, code so old it was forgotten. "Find me someone who knows this system," Julian roared. But the original creators were all gone, or so they thought. Arthur watched from the doorway as the boardroom descended into chaos. Arthur stepped inside. The security guard tried to stop him, but Arthur's gaze was like cold steel. He walked straight to the main terminal. The room went silent. Julian sneered, "Get out, old man. This isn't a spill for you to clean." Arthur didn't blink. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a tarnished silver key. "You're right, Julian," he said. "It's a virus. I wrote." The silence that followed was deafening. Arthur's fingers flew across the keyboard with a speed that defied his age. Lines of green code danced across the screens. He wasn't just a janitor. He was the ghost in the machine. While Julian stared in disbelief, Arthur dismantled the attack in minutes. As the systems turned green, Arthur turned to face the board. "I built this company to change the world," he whispered, "not to be sold to the highest bidder." The boardroom was a cage of glass and steel, now filled with the stench of panic. Julian Vane paced like a trapped animal, his expensive suit soaked in sweat. "The encryption is eating our data," he screamed at the lead developer. "In 10 minutes, every bank account linked to Aether Dynamics will be empty." The developer's hands shook as he stared at the screen. "It's a ghost code, sir. We can't break it." Outside the glass walls, the office was in chaos. Employees were frantic. Phones were ringing off the hook, and the company's stock price was plummeting on the news monitors. Arthur stood in the hallway, leaning on his mop. He looked at the chaos not with fear, but with a strange, calm authority. He knew exactly who was behind this. It wasn't a rival company. It was a mistake Julian had made years ago. Arthur pushed his cleaning cart toward the boardroom doors. 2 security guards stepped in his way. "Areas restricted, old man," one said. Shoving Arthur back, Arthur didn't move an inch. He straightened his back, and for a split second, the humble janitor disappeared. In his place stood a man of immense power. "If I don't go in there," Arthur said, his voice like cracking ice, "this building will be an empty shell by noon." The heavy oak doors swung open with a thud. Julian didn't even look up. "I told you, no distractions," he roared. But the sudden silence of the room made him turn. There stood Arthur, the man he had mocked for years. No mop, no bucket, just a cold, calculating stare that Julian hadn't seen since he was a junior intern. The board members whispered in confusion. Arthur walked straight to the head of the table. "This code," Arthur began, his voice echoing through the room like a judge's gavel, "isn't a hack. It's a self-destruct sequence I embedded in the kernel 30 years ago. It was a fail-safe I built against corporate greed." Julian laughed, a desperate, hollow sound. You're a janitor. You can barely use a smartphone." Arthur ignored the insult, his eyes fixed on the monitor where red lines of data were bleeding out. Arthur reached into his pocket and pulled out a tarnished silver Kia model, so old it looked like a relic. "In 2005, you stole the patents for the Aether grid and ousted the man who saved your father's legacy. You thought he was gone. You thought he was broken." He inserted the key into the main console. Suddenly, a logo appeared on every screen, a golden compass, the original seal of the silent architect. The room went dead silent. Julian's face turned the color of ash. He remembered the stories his father told on his deathbed about a man whose mind was a labyrinth of light. A man they had cheated to build their throne. "Impossible," Julian stammered, his bravado crumbling like dry sand. "Arthur was just an old man. My father kept around out of pity." Arthur leaned forward, his reflection sharp in the polished mahogany table. "Pity wasn't the reason, Julian, it was fear. 20 years ago, this room looked different. Arthur wasn't in a jumpsuit. He was the visionary CEO. He had developed a system that could power cities for free. But greed has a long shadow. Julian's father had manipulated the board, forged Arthur's signature, and stripped him of his shares in a single night. Instead of fighting a legal war that would destroy the company, Arthur chose a different path. He stayed in the shadows, waiting for the rot to show its face. "Why stay as a janitor?" a board member whispered, terrified. Arthur's eyes softened for a moment, thinking of his daughter, Clara, who needed expensive treatments the company's secret insurance still covered. To protect the core, Arthur replied, "I knew one day your hunger for profit would lead you to unlock doors you couldn't close. I stayed to be the only one with the key." He looked at the countdown on the screen. 3 minutes remained until total collapse. The red numbers on the wall were bleeding. 1:59. Julian fell to his knees, the weight of his father's sins finally crushing his spine. "Please," he choked out, the arrogance gone from his voice. "I'll give you anything. The money, the shares. Just stop the deletion." Arthur looked down at him, not with hatred, but with a cold, surgical precision. "I don't want your money, Julian. I want the truth. Sign the confession, and I'll stop the clock." Arthur pulled a single sheet of paper from his cleaning cart. It was a full confession of the 2005 fraud prepared years ago. "Sign this and transfer the voting rights back to the original founders' trust. The company belongs to the visionaries, not the vultures." The board members looked at each other, realizing their luxury lifestyles were about to evaporate. "Sign it now," one director yelled at Julian, "or we all go down with this ship." With trembling hands, Julian scrawled his name. As the clock hit 0:15, Arthur's fingers flew across the keyboard. He didn't just stop the virus. He patched the system with a code Julian had never seen, a self-evolving firewall. The screens flickered from angry red to a calm deep blue. The data was safe. The empire survived, but its king was officially deposed. Arthur stood up, his old jumpsuit now looking like a royal robe in the morning light. News of the cyber attack and the miracle recovery leaked within minutes. Journalists swarmed the lobby of Aether Dynamics, their cameras flashing like lightning. They expected to see Julian Vane, the golden boy of tech, giving a triumphant speech. Instead, the elevator doors opened to reveal a man in a faded blue jumpsuit, flanked by the city's top legal team. The silence that fell over the press corps was absolute. Arthur didn't hide from the cameras. He stood tall, his hands scarred from years of manual labor resting calmly on the podium. "My name is Arthur Sterling," he said, his voice amplified by a dozen microphones. 30 years ago, I founded this company to serve humanity. For the last 20, I watched it serve greed. From the corridors, I cleaned. A collective gasp echoed through the lobby. The janitor was the king, and the king was back. Behind the scenes, Julian was being escorted out through a service exit, his face hidden by a jacket. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was leaving the Empire through the very door Arthur had used for decades. Arthur's confession was already live on every major news network. The billionaire janitor became an overnight global sensation. People weren't just shocked by his wealth. They were moved by his patience and his unbreakable integrity. The first board meeting under Arthur's leadership didn't happen in the glass boardroom. He gathered the directors in the building's basement, the place where the maintenance staff ate their lunch. To lead a company, Arthur said, looking at the uncomfortable executives sitting on plastic chairs, you must understand the ground it stands on. His first decree was simple but revolutionary. Every janitor and security guard was now a shareholder. Arthur didn't fire everyone. He gave them a choice: adapt to a culture of transparency or leave with a severance package. He established the Sterling Fund, a multi-billion-dollar initiative to provide free healthcare and education for the families of every blue-collar worker in the city. He wasn't just fixing a company. He was repairing the broken social contract Julian's father had destroyed. The office atmosphere transformed overnight. Late that evening, Arthur returned to his old locker. He pulled out the worn-out mop he had used for years. He didn't throw it away. He placed it in a glass display case in the main lobby. Beneath it, a new plaque was installed. It didn't list his net worth or his degrees. It simply read, "Service is the highest form of leadership." He was no longer cleaning floors, but he was still sweeping away the dirt of corruption. Arthur drove a modest car to the St. Jude's medical wing. He didn't need a limousine to feel like a man of substance. In room 402, a young woman with his same bright eyes sat by the window. Clara, his daughter, had spent half her life battling a rare condition. She knew her father worked hard, but she always thought he was just a humble worker. She had no idea he was the man who owned the very hospital she was in. "Dad, you look different today," Clara whispered as Arthur sat beside her. He took her hand, his rough palms a stark contrast to her soft skin. "The work is finished, Clara," he said, his voice trembling for the first time. He explained that the cure she needed, a specialized gene therapy, was no longer stuck behind a corporate paywall. He had authorized its release to the public for free. He hadn't just saved his company, he had saved her life. The tears in Clara's eyes weren't for the money or the sudden fame. They were for the 30 years her father had spent in the shadows, cleaning up after the people who had robbed him, just to keep her insurance active. "You did all that for me?" she asked. Arthur kissed her forehead. "I would have swept the entire world for you, Clara, in that small hospital room." The billionaire janitor finally found the only wealth that mattered. While Arthur was in the hospital, Julian Vane sat in a cold interrogation room. The expensive silk tie was gone, replaced by a sense of impending doom. Federal agents laid out the evidence: the forged signatures, the hidden offshore accounts, and the systematic theft of Arthur's legacy. Julian's lawyers had already abandoned him. He wasn't just losing his job, he was losing his freedom. The empire he thought he owned had turned into his prison. A week later, Arthur visited Julian before his sentencing. Julian looked up, his eyes bloodshot. "Why didn't you just kill me professionally years ago?" Julian spat. Arthur stood behind the glass partition, looking at the man who had tried to erase him. "Because I wanted you to build it first," Arthur replied calmly. "You worked so hard to grow the company my father started. You did the heavy lifting. I just waited for you to make it worth taking back." Arthur leaned closer to the glass. "You thought power came from the title on your door? But true power comes from being indispensable. He slid a small photograph across the tabula, picture of the maintenance staff now running the logistics department. The people you ignored are the ones who will rebuild what you broke. You're not a villain, Julian. You're just a mistake that's finally been corrected. Arthur walked away, leaving Julian in silence. 1 year later, Aether Dynamics was no longer just a tech giant. It was a symbol of hope. Arthur didn't move back into the CEO's penthouse. He stayed in his small, modest house, but he spent his days in the research labs, guiding the next generation of inventors. He taught them that a brilliant mind is worthless without a compassionate heart. The world called him the Billionaire Janitor, but to him, he was just a father who kept his word. Every year, on the anniversary of the Great Reset, Arthur walks into the lobby at 5 a.m. He doesn't go to the executive elevator. Instead, he picks up a cloth and polishes the brass plaque with the golden compass. He does it to remind himself of where he came from. The employees who pass by don't look away anymore. They stop, they nod, and they remember that every person they encounter is fighting a battle they know nothing about. As the sun sets over the city, Arthur stands on the balcony of his home, watching the lights of the skyline flicker to lifelights, powered by his clean energy. Clara stands beside him, healthy and strong, her future as bright as the stars above. Arthur's journey taught the world a simple truth. Your current position is not your identity. Whether you hold a pen or a mop, your character is what defines your kingdom. The silence of the architect was finally over.